Hi, in this talk I will be discussing narratives and storytelling in the context of science communication. Now, I'd like to start by going back to the idea of the importance of communication and the media for engaging the public with scientific concepts. So I'd like to start with this circle, which represents the universe. Now you might be thinking, that's not a circle, that's just a line. Well, what if I tell you that it's just a really big circle and we're zoomed way in, and if you followed either end of this line around, you might discover it is indeed a circle, because it is the universe and the universe is big. And then within the big universe, in a small little corner of it, scientists engage in scientific research, they make empirical observations, and come to some sort of understanding of that little piece of the universe. And then within the universe, at least as far as humans are concerned, there are the media, which are interested in various aspects of things that happen in the universe, and also sometimes talk about scientific phenomena. And then, of course, there are individuals who have daily life experiences. A lot of what individuals know and understand just comes through their daily interactions and getting to know the universe through living it. But sometimes they engage with a more scientific representation and a more scientific understanding of the universe. And sometimes people do that through engaging directly with scientists or through conducting science themselves by being active participants in science. But more often than not, people get their science information, their scientific understanding through the media. And this lopsided Venn diagram I have over here shows that intersecting in the middle, where scientific understanding, media, and daily life intersect. That's really where individuals come to understand scientific phenomena through the media. And it's quite important. There's this concept called mediation, and mediation can occur to all different types of knowledge and understanding. None the least, it can happen to understanding of science. And so the concept of mediation is simple. It's the transmission of meaning via the mass media. Can be any kind of meaning, really. Audiences, this is another important aspect of mediation. Audiences actively participate in constructing meaning from the media. They interpret media messages, come to conclusions about what it means, what types of attitudes or beliefs they should have, how those messages and ideas in the messages comport with or correspond with their personal values. And through that process, they essentially co-create meaning. There are the messages in the media, and then individuals' interpretations of those messages result in meaning for individuals. And this is very much how the public interprets media messages about science. And this process is useful for science for a few reasons. First, the mass media reach mass audiences. This is a way to communicate about science with a lot of people. Audiences can learn indirectly. That's something I talked about on the previous slide. A lot of what people learn about the universe and about science isn't through direct experience, but through indirect experience via the media. And then finally, audiences can take new perspectives through encountering new ideas and new ways of thinking in the media, and ways of thinking and perspectives that maybe they wouldn't have thought of on their own. And so it helps them think through scientific issues and come to new scientific understandings in ways that they might not have had they maintained their previous perspective. Now, the media are often quite selective in what types of messages they produce, and this makes sense. Media producers want to make what audiences are going to watch. They want to make sure they can bring in subscription revenue or advertising revenue. And unsurprising, narratives are quite an attractive way to communicate with audiences. Audiences like stories. And so the media like to use stories to reach out to audiences, whatever they're communicating about. Could be entertainment content, could be informative content, educational content, but stories are effective. Audiences like stories, and the media use stories. But what happens when the media use stories to talk about scientific issues? Well, it can be a good way to engage science with, or to engage the public with science, but it can also be bad. I found this clip online. Let's watch it.
Well, now, this is a story of an amazingly beautiful young woman. She was training to be a pro football cheerleader, and she got a flu shot. She says that shot has destroyed her chances of happiness. We told you about her story last time. Now, Les Trent is with this woman for a first-hand look at what her life has become.
So this seems like quite the compelling news story. It is the story of a young woman who received a flu shot and a few days later fell ill and developed a serious neurological disorder. And I'm not saying this is a misrepresentation of science. I don't actually know what types of side effects are associated with what flu vaccines, and it's entirely plausible that yes, indeed, this woman's neurological disorder resulted from the flu shot. I don't know, but the important point here is that it seems plausible, and this is one of the reasons why narratives are strong and effective ways of communicating, but can also be problematic, because this story might seem to be true because it could happen, not necessarily because it will happen. And so stories like that can be used to communicate effectively with audiences, but is it really connecting them with the facts of science? And so there's the narrative storytelling versus facts. So I'd like to just spend a little bit of time talking about some features of scientific fact reporting versus science-related stories as different ways of communicating about science. And my friend Michael Dahlstrom wrote an article in 2014 for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in which he talked about factors that differentiate scientific fact from stories. The first of those is the direction of generalizability. And you have to think about how people process different types of information and draw conclusions from those information. So when there are scientific results, usually scientific results are based on studies with large samples and careful measurement, robust statistical analyses. These results ideally can be generalized, and so general truths are stated on the basis of those findings. And then given a general truth, a general understanding that in most situations X causes Y, individuals have an understanding of the sequence of events. They're able to make predictions. If they observe X, they can reasonably predict that they will subsequently see Y. And this is the process of deductive reasoning. That's the direction of the generalization. On the other hand, with stories, what stories do is they present a sequence of events. X caused Y in this particular situation, in this particular setting. And from that sequence of events, audiences need to imagine what is the general truth that would allow that sequence of events to occur. And then they draw conclusions about how things must be given that one instance. And this is the process of induction. Now, I'm not saying that deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning is better than the other. In fact, a lot of scientific researchers use inductive reasoning in their work. Qualitative researchers often gather stories of individuals and, looking through multiple stories, draw linkages and arrive at what they think is a general truth from those collections of stories, and that's an example of inductive reasoning in science. The challenge with, or the limitation of inductive reasoning is it cannot be used to make predictions. So me making a prediction about the likelihood of suffering adverse side effects from getting a flu shot, I shouldn't be making those decisions on the basis of a few isolated stories because they probably don't generalize. Even if indeed in some cases a vaccine had a severe adverse side effect, it's probably something that happens quite rarely. The next differentiating feature between stories and facts is the reliance on context. And so with scientific facts, they can be understood often in isolation, and in isolation, scientific facts can be meaningful. On the other hand, story elements need the context of the story to make sense, and they really aren't useful in isolation. And so I'm going to give you an example. This is a drawing of a tardigrade in a spacesuit on a rocket ship. If you haven't heard of a tardigrade before, they are amazing creatures. They're microscopic animals, teeny tiny animals. You really have to see them under a microscope. And they're like super animals. They're able to survive in the vacuum of space. They're able to survive exposure to high levels of radiation. They can survive extreme heat and extreme cold. Okay, so I've just given you a bunch of scientific facts about tardigrades. You could go tell one of your friends, hey, did you know that tardigrades can survive extreme heat? That's one scientific fact. And your friend might say to you, no, nerd, I didn't know that. Or your friend might say, I don't really care. Or your friend might say, huh, I didn't know that. That's interesting. What are tardigrades? Right? But in all those reactions, it's clear that they understood what you shared with them was a complete piece of information. They might not know what tardigrades are, but they understand that there are things called tardigrades that can withstand extreme heat. Now let's say I'm reading the children's book, Jessie the Tardigrade Goes to Mars. Let's just pretend this image is from that children's storybook, and there's a line in the story that what Jessie saw surprised her. And you go tell your friend that, hey, what Jessie saw surprised her. Your friend's going to be like, huh? Who's Jessie? And what's Jessie doing? And what's going on? I have no idea the point of what you just said. There's no meaning there, right? And so that story element by itself doesn't work. But the one piece of scientific fact by itself, you know, it might lead to some more questions, but it's understandable as something, as a piece of knowledge by itself. So that's something that's different between facts and stories. And then the third thing that Dahlstrom talks about is the standards for legitimacy. What is the standard that audiences use to evaluate whether a claim is valid, is legitimate? And so for scientific facts, it's all about accuracy. The claim needs to be accurate because scientific facts are based on empirical observations. It needs to accurately reflect what was actually observed. The standard for legitimacy for stories, on the other hand, it's a much lower bar. It needs to be a reasonable representation of reality. It needs to be fairly realistic. The events portrayed need to be things that could happen. Not necessarily that they would happen, but that they could happen. And if they could happen, then it's a legitimate story. But this is a challenge because that level of legitimacy or that determination, it's tough to refute. It's such a low bar. It's tough to refute it with scientific facts where the standard is so much higher. So narratives can be quite persuasive given this feature. Now, another reason why narratives are effective has to do with how people process information. Now, in general, people process information or engage with information and process it first by having an interest. They orient themselves to certain types of information. Certain information interests them, it's what they want. So they orient themselves to it. Then they pay attention. They allocate cognitive resources to doing something with that message. After they've paid attention, they might engage in elaboration, thinking more about what the message says. And then finally, if they learn something new that was valuable, they might commit it to long-term memory. Now, this is how people process all different kinds of information, but people do this more for narratives. People tend to be more interested in narratives and stories. They automatically orient to stories. They're like, oh, a story is being told, I should pay attention. They're likely to pay more attention to stories. They're likely to elaborate more on stories and think more about what the story means, right? And think about what happened in that story and how it relates to their own experiences. And then finally, they're more likely to remember elements and details from stories. So people really put more effort into engaging with narratives. And this basic idea fits into a much bigger model. I'm going to step over here because, oh goodness, it's overlaying on top of me. It's such a big model. This is a nice model representing how good stories can lead to attitude and behavior change. So a good story has things like story appeal, high production quality. If it is a persuasive story, the persuasive intent is subtle. And then realistic and relatable characters. And so these are all of the nodes on the far left of the diagram. Those are things that make a good story. Now, when a story is good, audiences tend to really engage with the story and get lost in the story. I think most of us have experienced this, getting transported into a narrative, feeling like we are there. Now, researchers have shown that transportation uses a lot of mental resources. Remember, people orient more, they pay more attention, they elaborate more, they really think more, they engage cognitive resources more when there are narratives that they're engaging with. And this uses a lot of their cognitive capacity that they might otherwise be using to critically evaluate the message and to engage in counter-arguing if there are persuasive claims being made. And so transportation can lead to greater message acceptance because it reduces counter-arguing. But it can also lead to greater message acceptance by audiences identifying with characters. When audiences get transported into narratives, they feel more connected to characters, especially if those characters are realistic and relatable. And so characters who support a particular view, who are aligned with a particular message, might encourage audiences to accept that view and accept that message. So there will be greater message acceptance and subsequently attitude and behavior change. And this idea of identification with characters is important. I think we've all experienced it. We have favorite characters and we understand their mindset and we understand their beliefs and we align some of our own beliefs with theirs because we relate to them. This is an important concept. It's called parasocial interaction, which a lot of researchers study, which explains this phenomenon of connecting with characters, and especially connecting with characters in narratives. And so I'm just going to read a quote that summarizes kind of what this concept is by Slater and Runer. To the extent of the recipient's sympathetic response to the character's own development and experiences, the persuasive impact of the narrative may lead to at least temporary acceptance of values and beliefs that represent a shift from the individual's existing beliefs. So this is one of the ways that stories can be compelling and persuasive. And so far in this lecture, I've basically made the point that narratives are effective. But should we, science communicators, and should scientists engaged in science communication use narratives? Well, something else Dahlstrom talked about was some of the ethical considerations of using narratives for science communication. So first, what is the goal of science communication? Is it to persuade? Is it to convince audiences of a particular viewpoint and a particular course of action? Or should audiences be given agency to make their own decision? And should they be given agency by being provided with as much information that they can handle so they can make their own decision? This is a bit of an ethical conundrum. If changing audiences is the desire of science communicators, then they should pursue persuasion. And in some contexts, audiences really need to be persuaded. But then at the same time, shouldn't audiences be autonomous? Shouldn't they have agency in making their own decisions? So that's the first ethical conundrum. The second has to do with accuracy. So there's a little bit of a trade-off when using stories and narratives to convey science information. Highly accurate representations of science may reduce some of the narrative qualities, the story element of the narrative. And so somebody who's trying to craft So a science communicator who's trying to craft a highly compelling narrative might want to relax the stringent requirements for accuracy. And that makes sense to an extent because the message won't be effective unless it's, or will be much less effective if it's not a compelling narrative. But then at what point is that relaxation of accuracy a problem? And so this is one of the, not so much of an ethical conundrum, but something that science communicators really need to be mindful of, that they need to maintain a reasonable level of accuracy so that audiences don't misunderstand scientific phenomena. Now, related to accuracy is this idea of representativeness. Earlier I gave the example, showed the media clip of the young woman who's, according to the clip, whose flu shot gave her a serious neurological disorder. Now, is that situation representative of what happens when people get flu shots? I would say absolutely not. Yeah, maybe it's plausible it could happen, and in her case maybe it did happen, but it's not probable. It's extremely unlikely. That video clip from that news story is probably quite persuasive. It probably affects what a lot of audiences think about vaccines and about the risk of side effects. And a lot of audiences probably overestimate the risk of certain side effects because that story makes severe side effects a lot more salient in their minds. And so they form inaccurate beliefs because the case, the example they saw in the story, was an extreme case and not representative. But extreme cases can be more persuasive. So again, it comes back to the argument of, does the science communicator want to be really impactful or want to make sure that audiences have a clear understanding of the science that they're discussing? And then finally, is it even appropriate for scientists to be using narratives? I mean, scientists aren't trained in narrative production. This is something that media students study, right? And so shouldn't media content producers be making those types of stories? Well, that's kind of a weak argument because the obvious counter-argument is if non-experts are using narratives to talk about science, then don't scientists have an obligation to use narratives to talk about science? After all, narratives can be a highly persuasive mode of communication. And so that's all I wanted to talk about in this lecture, narratives and storytelling in the context of science communication. Thanks for watching.